The tension wasn't scripted. It wasn't for ratings. When Senator Tim Scott went after Denzel Washington during a live panel on national television, no one expected what came next. Scott, who had been making the rounds touting a message of real American values, abruptly pivoted toward Denzel with an accusation that felt personal. You Hollywood elites think your fame gives you moral authority. But it just proves how out of touch you are with real Americans. The room fell quiet. Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He waited a beat, then leaned in with quiet confidence. "Let me stop you right there, Senator," he said. "I've never claimed to speak for all Americans. I speak from experience, growing up with struggle, working 2 jobs, losing people. I loved and choosing every day to show up and do something better with the platform I've earned." "You want to talk about values? Let's start with honesty." The audience stirred. Tim Scott's expression stiffened. Scott, trying to recover, launched into a well-rehearsed monologue about the importance of self-reliance and personal accountability. But Denzel didn't let it slide. "Accountability doesn't mean dismissing the truth just because it's uncomfortable," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It means looking at the full picture, how systems shape lives, how communities are affected, and what responsibility those in power have to lift others up instead of pointing fingers at artists who speak out." The energy shifted. Scott stumbled for a moment, visibly trying to reframe the narrative, but the damage was done. Denzel's words didn't come from a place of defense, they came from lived conviction. He wasn't there to debate. He was there to tell the truth, and it landed with weight. The clip exploded across platforms within hours. Hashtags like hashtag Denzel v. Scott and hashtag Clapback of the Year dominated Twitter and TikTok. Commentators from both sides of the aisle couldn't ignore what they saw. A U.S. senator, outclassed and outresoned by an actor whose grasp of reality felt more grounded than the political talking points thrown his way. Denzel didn't celebrate or post follow-ups. He stayed silent in the aftermath, letting the moment speak for itself. But those who watched it unfold knew exactly what they'd seen. Tim Scott came in expecting to corner a celebrity and, instead, got a masterclass in poise, perspective, and purpose. As pundits scrambled to spin the exchange, the overwhelming consensus was undeniable. Denzel Washington hadn't just responded, he'd redefined the moment. While Tim Scott retreated into standard partisan defenses in later interviews, claiming he was just trying to highlight a disconnect between Hollywood and real Americans, the internet wasn't buying it. Denzel's remarks had cut deeper than expected because they weren't delivered as a personal attack. They were an unshakable reflection of reality. "You don't know my community better than I do," Denzel had said quietly during the panel, "and you don't get to decide whose voice matters based on job titles." That line alone was clipped, captioned, and viewed millions of times within 24 hours. Journalists began comparing the moment to other iconic political takedowns in media history. But even seasoned anchors agreed there was something different about this one. It wasn't bluster or insult, it was clarity. And it reminded people that influence doesn't come from shouting louder, it comes from saying something that can't be easily dismissed. In contrast to Tim Scott's polished rhetoric, Denzel had offered authenticity. That contrast didn't just expose a weakness in Scott's approach, it reshaped how viewers saw both men. And in the process, it made one thing crystal clear. When truth meets performance, truth wins every time. In the days following the broadcast, political commentators, celebrities, and everyday viewers alike were still buzzing about what many were calling one of the most memorable televised confrontations of the year. What lingered wasn't just Denzel Washington's eloquence, it was the precision of his delivery. Without shouting, without dramatics, he managed to strip down Tim Scott's arguments and expose the hollow core behind the talking points. "I come from where people don't get second chances," Denzel had said during one particularly cutting moment. "So don't talk to me about bootstrap stories unless you're ready to talk about broken ladders." The line reverberated far beyond the studio, ended up as a headline, a quote in op-eds, and a rallying cry across social media. Scott's allies tried to frame Denzel's response as Hollywood grandstanding. but the narrative had already moved on. Clips of the exchange were being played in classrooms, shared in podcasts, and dissected in political roundtables, not because Denzel won the moment, but because he had elevated the conversation. His refusal to be boxed in by labels or baited into theatrics reminded many that real discourse isn't about volume, it's about depth. And for a public increasingly exhausted by shallow exchanges and media spin, Denzel's steady voice felt like something rare and vital, a moment of truth in a culture of noise. Asterisk, by the end of the week, the moment had taken on a life of its own. The exchange between Tim Scott and Denzel Washington was no longer just about two men with opposing worldviews. It had become a broader symbol of a cultural crossroads. Commentators began pointing out how the confrontation reflected the growing divide between political branding and lived experience. Scott had come prepared to deliver a speech. Denzel had come prepared to tell the truth. And when the two collided, the truth resonated louder. This wasn't Hollywood versus Washington, one columnist wrote. It was rehearsed ideology meeting. Raw authenticity and ideology blinked first. Asterisk, more telling than the headlines, however, was the public's reaction. Viewers, regardless of party affiliation, praised Denzel for showing what integrity in public discourse could look like. He didn't try to humiliate. He didn't pivot or deflect. He answered directly, from the gut, with a calmness that couldn't be rattled. It reminded audiences of something they rarely see on television anymore, an adult conversation. No one expected Denzel to become the centerpiece of a viral political moment, but that's what made it land so hard. He didn't perform. He simply stood in what he believed. And in a space flooded with sound bites and spin, that alone felt revolutionary. Asterisk, as the media cycle moved on, what remained was the impact of Denzel Washington's presence, not just his words, but the weight behind them. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, noting how he never once raised his voice or interrupted, even when provoked. That restraint, far from being a sign of weakness, became the foundation of his strength. You don't have to be loud. To be powerful, one clip was captioned, you just have to be real. In contrast, Tim Scott's performance, once hailed by supporters as confident and assertive now, seemed overly rehearsed and hollow when placed side by side with Denzel's unscripted honesty. It wasn't just a political difference, it was a difference in tone, in substance, in credibility. Asterisk, in classrooms, churches, and barbershops. The moment sparked discussions beyond politics about respect, about lived experience, and about what it means to truly listen. Denzel didn't just rebut Tim Scott's attack, he revealed the fatigue so many Americans feel when empty narratives are repeated louder than real stories. His demeanor was a mirror held up to a culture obsessed with confrontation, but showing instead the quiet force of grounded conviction. For many watching, especially younger viewers, it was a blueprint proof that dignity and strength can coexist, and that sometimes the most devastating answer is the calmest one. Asterisk, in the weeks that followed. Denzel Washington's quiet dismantling of Tim Scott's argument continued to ripple through public consciousness as a fleeting viral clip. But as a cultural reference point, late-night hosts nodded to it, educators quoted it in lectures, and even faith leaders cited it as a moment of righteous clarity. What stuck wasn't some dramatic mic drop or insult, but Denzel's ability to cut through the noise with conviction anchored in experience. When you've seen the cost of silence, he'd said, you stop letting people redefine the truth. To make it more comfortable, that single line became a touchstone, shared in countless posts as both inspiration and warning. Asterisk, meanwhile, Tim Scott's follow-up appearances felt increasingly strained. He doubled down on his message, but without the confrontation to fuel the spotlight, interest faded. Denzel, on the other hand, never addressed the moment again. He didn't need to. His restraint became part of the power of his response. It wasn't about dragging someone online or dominating a news cycle. It was about showing that you don't have to conform to the game to win it. And in an era when discourse is often reduced to outrage and sound bites, that made Denzel's approach not only unforgettable, but revolutionary. Asterisk.